All right, so what you see is not clickbait. The title's not clickbait. The thumbnail's not clickbait. We are going to talk about how Florida might flip because we now have enough election data from the special elections coming in that we can start seeing a pattern, and these patterns really help the Democrats. So we're going to go into these numbers. We're going to see how that might affect the midterms less than a year from now, because the numbers are really good for the Democrats. And honestly, I didn't think we would be talking about Florida. I've been one of the people who have poo-pooed on Florida most of the time, but it looks like there's some potential, not a win, but potential in the state of Florida. Now, I know there are going to be a lot of Republicans out there, especially MAGA people who don't realize there were elections before 2016, saying, "Oh, Florida's a red state. It's always been a red state. We're gonna easily win that." Well, maybe you will. Okay, but I do want to bring this up from 2012. These are the exit polls in 2012 for the presidential race. And we have some huge states in there that either the Democrat or the Republican is going to win easy. We got New York, Massachusetts, California, Connecticut, Indiana, Missouri, right? But we don't have Georgia in here. The reason why we don't have Georgia, Georgia was considered such a red state in 2012 that people, the networks and New York Times, no one even bothered doing exit polling in that state. It was a waste of money. Okay. What happened 4 years later is a lot closer. What happened 8 years later? Joe Biden won it. So never think that, elections are fluid. Never think that these election results are going to be static. They will change over time. Okay. Look at Andrew Gillum's result against DeSantis, and then look at Charlie Crist's result against DeSantis 4 years later. That gives you an indication right there. But before we get into the numbers I want to talk about, let's go ahead and just look at just a recap of what happened 2 nights ago in Florida. We do have Eileen Higgins winning 59.5% to 40.5%. Now, she is the Democratic candidate, but it was a nonpartisan race. But if we go over to the legislative races, which were special elections, we can see that in District 11 of the state Senate, the Republican won with 59.2%. The Republican should be winning that district by around 67, 68, 69, maybe 70%. This was a huge swing to the Democratic side. Now, if we go ahead and look at the state representative seats in Palm Beach County in District 90, we can see that it was a Democratic seat before, the Democrat won 63.2% of the votes. Democrats usually win 56%. So we're seeing these huge swings that are happening in these districts. Now, let me go ahead and throw a graphic up that I have talked about quite a bit. And this is the special election in the 1st Congressional District in Florida. And one thing that I've always talked about is how the amount of votes that Jimmy Patronis, the Republican candidate, had was actually less than the amount of registered Republicans who voted in that election. So we're going to make an assumption here. You have to make assumptions when you're doing models and trying to figure out how things are. And that assumption is that if all registered Republicans voted Republican and all registered Democrats voted Democrats, what would we have in the middle? Now, I know there are going to be people there saying, "Dave, vote choice and self-identification of partisanship doesn't equal voter party registration." That's true, but the R square in the state of Florida is like 0.95%. It is really strongly correlated. So we can pretty much make that assumption spot on. With that being the case, if we look at the Jimmy Patronis race, what we're basically saying is that if all of the Democrats voted for the Democratic candidates and all of the non-party affiliated voters and minor party voters also voted for the Democratic candidates, there'd still be like 1,500 Republican voters who voted for the Democratic candidate. This is a huge swing. And this is what we're going to talk about today, because the Jimmy Patronis race is not unique. And it does look like that the Republicans, if they win or lose or whatever, that the Republicans are only getting their base, and anybody who is not part of that base is just flipping over to the Democratic side. So let me go ahead and show you the first graphic here. Now, you can see that it says registration versus votes. So this is the number of registered voters to votes received by party candidates. Okay, so that first congressional district we see right here, this is the one that I just mentioned. So if we say Jimmy Patronis got 100,000 votes, okay, if you see 101.6, that means the number of Republicans who voted were 101,600. So any number that is over 100% is bad for the Republicans. Any number that is close to 100% is bad for the Republicans, because that means that they're only getting registered Republicans voting for them. If it gets lower and lower and lower, that means they're getting more independents, okay? But if it's at 100, that means that essentially all the Democrats and independents shifted over to the Democratic side. Now, if we look at the Democratic number, we see that that is 66.9%. So what does that mean? Let's say the Democratic candidate got 100,000 votes. This would mean that only 70% of that vote that the Democratic candidate had was from registered Democrats, meaning the other 30% are from non-party affiliated voters and minor party voters. Okay, so let's go through some of these districts. So the 6th congressional district, which is the Randy Fine district that happened on the same day, you can see 93.9%. It was almost entirely his base that won, whereas the Democrat was at 74.2. Now let's go over to State Senate 19. We can see, again, the Republicans, 94%, the Democrats, 72.8%. So let's go over to the next group of elections, State Senate 15. Now, these next two seats are Democratic seats, which is the reason why they might seem a little bit closer. But in State Senate 15th, which is in Orange County, you can see the Republican vote 96%. So of the people who voted for the Republican candidate, chances are 96% of that were registered Republicans. On the Democratic side, it was 84%. Okay, go to State House 90, we talked about earlier, 91.9% to 80.2%. Now let's go to State House 3, okay, the third State House race. We see that dynamic again, 100.2%. So what does that mean? That essentially means the Republican candidate who ran in State House 3 received the same amount of votes as the number of registered Republicans who voted in the race. So that essentially means that all of the Democrats and all the non-party affiliated voters went to the Democratic side. Now, of course, this isn't exact, because you probably had a lot of non-party affiliated voters go over to the Republican side, which then means that would have been, swapped out by Republican registered voters, which is even more impressive. We don't really have a way to figure that out unless we get into the really granular detail. I just don't have the income for that. But what's interesting about the State House race here, the third State House race, in that congressional race, is that these are both seats in the Panhandle. And usually in the Panhandle, it is the total opposite. It's usually that the Democratic candidate has less votes than the amount of Democrats who actually vote in the election. So these numbers are huge. Now, let's go to the state Senate seat that we just had, the one that I mentioned earlier in the video. You can see 93.1% is the number for the Republicans compared to 72.6% for the Democrats. So if we average out the state that we've had, there was one other special election I didn't include because I couldn't break down the numbers in that election. So, and it was a state house seat in Orange County, but my guess is the trend would have been the same. But if we average all of these special elections out, these 7 that we have, we can see that the Republican number is 95.8, with the Democratic number being 74.6. So what's that mean? That means on average in the state of Florida, if we're saying that Republicans vote Republican, Democrats vote Democrat, then the non-party and minor parties go wherever, what we're saying is that 95% of the Republican vote comes from their own registered voters. 95%. Okay. Whereas we're saying that for the Democrats, it's only 3/4. So that shows a huge swing over to the Democratic side. Now, let's go ahead and put this in perspective of a midterm election and voter registration. What we could expect. Okay. So these are the current voter registration numbers in the state of Florida. So you can see the Republicans are at 41%, the Democrats are at 30.5%, and non-party affiliated and others are at 28.5%. You might look at these and say, okay, the Republicans are ahead by 5.4 million. Okay. But if we're seeing these independents flip the way they are, then it doesn't matter. The Republicans in the early and mid 90s and early 2000s, they were winning elections quite handily in the state of Florida with the numbers flipped. It was like the Democrats had that top number and the Republicans had that bottom number. And a lot of people might say, that's because of the panhandle. Not really. The panhandle only accounted for a small number of that. So yeah, in this situation, we've seen the Republicans win with a Democratic voter base. Now we're seeing that could change. So this is our current party registration numbers right now. Most important thing here is to know the numbers, the raw numbers. Okay, now let's go ahead and look at voter turnout in 2022, because the reason why the Democrats did so poorly in the state of Florida in the last midterm elections was that the voter turnout was just really bad for the Democrats and really good for the Republicans. It was just the perfect storm for the Republicans to dominate the election. So as we see right here, the turnout rate for Republicans in 2022 was 65.3%. That was really good compared to normal. The Democratic rate was at 53.8%, which was really bad for the Democrats compared to the Republicans. There might usually be a Republican advantage of about 4%, 3%, but to have this, and that's even 4 or 5, we're getting into being a big gap. Having this big of a gap, that is huge. Now, what could we expect in the state of Florida? What could happen? So let's go back to the averages, okay? Where we're saying of the Republican vote, 95% of that is going to be registered Republicans, and of the Democratic vote, 74.6% of that is going to be Democratic, okay? Which means a huge swing over to the Democratic side when it comes to non-party affiliated voters. Now, if we take the turnout rates that we see here that we just talked about and our current voter registration numbers and apply those with the swing that we see with nonpartisans from the election data that we have so far, we see that the Republicans would still win 52.5 to 47.5. This makes Florida a very competitive state. Now, if Democratic voters are very motivated to go out there and vote, which they probably are way more now than before, chances are the voter turnout numbers, and I'll go back to that slide here, the voter turnout numbers will probably shrink. You'll probably see the Democrats inch up, and you might even see the Republicans inch down. And if that happens, and if we see the swings that we're seeing now, Florida could flip. Now, granted, leave it to the Florida Democratic Party and Florida Democrats to grab defeat out of the jaws of victory. That is what they're absolute kings at. But the numbers are there. We now have enough data to say Florida could flip, which means I'm going to lose $5 because I made a $5 bet with somebody regarding David Jolly that he would do worse than Charlie Crist, but it just seems like the dynamics in Florida now could be that we're going to see Florida maybe be a purple state in the near future. And what does this mean? This means that the Democrats need to treat NPA voters, nonpartisan or non-party affiliated voters, as soft Democratic voters, because that's the trend that we're seeing right now. And luckily, we know who voted in this last election. We have a whole database. Okay, if you're the Democratic Party, you take the people who voted in the 1st Congressional District. You take all the independents, non-party affiliated voters, minor party and stuff like that. You know that they probably voted Democratic. You need to be targeting those people like hell and the people in those areas like hell, because those are going to be the people that bring you to victory. Okay. Especially when Republicans only have 41% of registered voters. All right. I want to talk about this. We'll go into Florida maybe later in the next few weeks, but these numbers are good for the Democrats. All right. Thank you all very much. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.